The silence at my father's funeral was not just the kind of silence you expect at such a somber ceremony, it was the kind that wraps around your chest and squeezes. A silence that speaks louder than any words could. I stood near the back of the elegantly lit funeral home in Boston, watching the line of men in dark suits and women in muted dresses pay their respects. There were many familiar faces, powerful figures from the logistics industry, people my father respected, maybe even feared. But no one looked at me for more than a passing glance, as if I were a guest, not his daughter. My brothers, Matthew and Jason, were front and center. Of course they were. They greeted the guests with nods and firm handshakes, exuding the kind of confidence and control that people expected from Robert Harper's heirs. Every smile they gave, every head bowed in solemn gratitude, it was rehearsed, calculated. I saw them whispering, too, probably talking about company shares or board positions, or maybe just pretending I wasn't there at all. I hadn't expected warmth. But the coldness still stung. As the ceremony began, I took a seat alone in the second row. Not too close, not too distant. My mother's absence was heavy. She died when I was 12. After that, my father changed. He became more obsessed with order, numbers, strategy. And while Matthew and Jason followed his every step into the business world, I wandered toward art, writing, and eventually law. It made me different. Too different for him, I guess. The eulogy was delivered by one of his old colleagues, a man who talked more about Robert Harper's vision for the logistics sector than about the father we had lost. I listened carefully, not for sentiment, but for meaning. What would they choose to remember? What would they leave out? When the ceremony ended, the crowd began to thin. I approached the casket, standing silently in front of the polished wood. There were no dramatic gestures, no whispered goodbyes. Just the simple, unspoken truth that the man who shaped so much of my life was gone, and I wasn't sure how to feel about that. I was sad. But also detached. Maybe because he had been that way with me for most of my life. "Claire," a voice said behind me. I turned to see Jason, holding a glass of water. He didn't offer it. He just held it, like a prop. "Jason," I replied, meeting his eyes. "Glad you made it," he said. As if I were a distant cousin showing up out of obligation. "I'm his daughter," I reminded him. Calmly. Coldly. He didn't respond. Just gave a small nod and walked away. That moment cemented everything I had been feeling. Even here, in the final farewell to our father, I was invisible to them. Not hated. Just irrelevant. Like someone whose presence is tolerated, but never acknowledged. I looked around one last time before stepping outside. The late afternoon air was crisp, and the sky was heavy with clouds that refused to rain. A strange metaphor, I thought. Everything about this day was heavy, yet nothing had fully released. Not yet. I didn't stay for the after-service gathering. I didn't need more small talk from people who never knew me or only knew me as the daughter who moved away. Instead, I walked down the steps of the funeral home, each footfall sounding louder than it should, echoing against the marble. I got into a cab and gave the driver the address to my father's office, the one place no one expected me to go that day. But I needed to see it. Not for closure. For clarity. Because if there was one thing I learned in law school, it's that wills, legacies, and power always hide behind appearances. And my father was a man of appearances. I had a feeling that what he left behind wasn't going to be as simple as a goodbye. And I was right. We were still in black when we met in our father's office. The heavy scent of polished wood and leather filled the room, the kind of place designed to remind you of power. His desk, untouched, looked like he might walk back in at any moment. But there were only the three of us now, Matthew, Jason, and me. And the atmosphere was colder than ever. Matthew sat behind the desk like he already owned it. Jason leaned casually on the arm of one of the leather chairs, tossing glances at his phone like he had better places to be. I stood for a moment, unsure whether I was being invited to sit or merely tolerated. I chose to sit anyway, directly across from Matthew. "We wanted to speak with you," he began, his tone flat and formal. "About the company." "Of course. The company." Our family's empire. Harper Freight Systems, the logistical backbone of the East Coast, and the thing our father loved more than any of us. Jason finally put his phone down. Look, Claire, he said, there's no easy way to say this, so I'll just be direct. Matthew and I are going to take the lead moving forward. I blinked. Excuse me? Matthew clasped his hands together. You've never been involved in operations. You've lived your own life, and we respect that. But this company needs strong leadership. People who understand the industry. This isn't the place for emotional decisions. There it was. That word. Emotional. The eternal weapon used to silence women in boardrooms and living rooms alike. I tried to process it without reacting. I'm not here to make emotional decisions, I said slowly. I'm here because I'm part of this family. Because he was my father, too. Matthew raised an eyebrow. Claire, you're welcome to be involved in other ways. Public relations, perhaps. Community outreach. But the core of the company needs to be in steady hands. And those are yours? I asked, my voice sharp. Jason leaned forward, his tone turning patronizing. Come on, Claire. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. Harder. As if they were doing me a favor by pushing me aside. As if my presence was the inconvenience. I looked around the office, the framed awards, the old photographs of the three of us when we still pretended to be close. I remembered the late nights when I was younger, sitting outside this very room, waiting for my father to finish meetings that always seemed more important than anything else. Now, here I was, again on the outside looking in. But I didn't say any of that. I nodded, stood up slowly, and said, if that's how you see it, I won't stop you from making your assumptions. Matthew opened his mouth to speak again, but I was already heading to the door. As I walked out, I didn't feel defeated. Not yet. Because something about the way they spoke, their confidence, their certainty, felt too rehearsed. Too eager. It was as if they were rushing to declare themselves kings before the crown had even been placed. And something told me my father wasn't the type to hand over the keys without a final word. I just hadn't heard it yet. 2 days later, I found myself walking into the corner office of Alan Becker, my father's longtime legal advisor. The building was familiar, marble floors, tall windows, that sterile scent of order, but the tension in my chest was new. Matthew and Jason were already seated when I arrived. Both wore dark suits again, as if this were just another business meeting. They barely glanced at me. Alan stood as I entered. Claire, he said with a small nod, always professional, always composed. I returned the gesture and took the last empty seat across from his desk. There was a large envelope resting in front of him, thick, sealed, clearly important. I want to thank you all for coming on such short notice, Alan began. Robert's final directives were very clear. He made specific arrangements regarding his estate, particularly the future of Harper Freight Systems. Matthew leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jason tapped his fingers against the table, impatient. Alan continued, your father updated his legal will and corporate directives shortly before his health declined. His instructions are written, notarized, and fully enforceable. I could feel something shift in the room. Jason smirked slightly. Matthew's jaw tensed. Alan carefully broke the seal on the envelope, unfolded the documents, and began to read aloud. His voice was calm and measured, but every word struck like a drumbeat. To my sons, Matthew and Jason, I leave personal holdings and assets specified in Appendices C and D. As for the controlling shares of Harper Freight Systems, he paused. I saw Matthew straighten slightly, clearly expecting his name to follow. I hereby assign 59% ownership, including voting rights and executive authority, to my daughter, Claire Harper. Silence. Not the respectful silence of mourning. The kind that chokes a room. Jason laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. That's what? Alan didn't flinch. It is legally signed, witnessed, and filed. Matthew sat frozen. His eyes slowly narrowed as if trying to make sense of a language he'd never learned. You're saying she's the majority shareholder? I'm not saying anything, Alan replied. Robert is. Claire Harper is now the principal owner of Harper Freight Systems, and by extension, holds final say over executive decisions. They both turned to me, not with admiration or congratulation, but with open disbelief. Jason looked like he was waiting for me to admit it was a prank. Matthew, on the other hand, looked like he'd just swallowed glass. I said nothing. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just met their stares with the same calm I'd carried into law school, into courtrooms, into every room where I was told I didn't belong. They could question it all they wanted. The truth had already been written, and now, spoken aloud. Alan placed the documents back into the folder, sliding it across the table toward me. You'll need to sign the transfer acknowledgements by the end of the week. And then, Claire, we'll schedule your first briefing with the board. Jason leaned forward, his voice low and bitter. Did you know about this? I looked at him. No. I came here just as blind as you did. But I wasn't blind anymore. I didn't say a word as I left Alan Becker's office. I didn't need to. The silence left behind by Matthew and Jason was louder than anything I could have added. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware that somewhere on the 12th floor of a law office, a family legacy had just shifted in a single sentence. 59%. It echoed in my head like a drumbeat. Not because of the number itself, but because of what it represented. Control. Voice. Authority. And none of them saw it coming. I took a cab back to my apartment. The ride was quiet, the streets blurred through the window. I thought about my father, not the man everyone admired, but the man I had known. The one who rarely asked about my day, who spoke to me like a stranger once I chose a different path. He had always trusted Matthew. He trained Jason. But me? He tolerated me. Or so I believed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my living room, the documents open beside me. My name in black ink. Legal. Binding. Undeniable. I kept rereading the section that transferred control to me, as if it might disappear. By morning, the first message arrived. From Matthew. It was short. Formal. We should talk. About next steps. I didn't answer right away. I needed to see how far they'd go. By noon, Jason showed up. No warning. Just walked into the lobby of my building with 2 coffees in hand, like we were old friends about to have a casual chat. I met him downstairs, arms crossed. Figured you might want something warm, he said, offering the cup. I didn't take it. He cleared his throat. Look, Claire, we were surprised. But maybe this doesn't have to be a big deal. A big deal? I repeated. I mean, we can still make decisions together. You've got majority, sure, but I cut him off. This isn't about making decisions together. You and Matthew already did that. Without me. Remember? He blinked. That was different. We thought you didn't think at all, Jason. You assumed that I'd stay quiet. That I'd step aside. That I wasn't capable. He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Tell Matthew, I said, stepping back toward the elevator, that he can send me a formal proposal if he wants to be heard. From now on, everything goes through the proper channels. The elevator doors closed between us. Inside, I exhaled slowly. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I was done being small. I was done being underestimated. Back in my apartment, I sat at my desk and started drafting my own proposal. A plan for internal review. A list of key contracts. A quiet strategy that would begin showing the board, and everyone else, what kind of leadership they had just inherited. Because respect isn't given. It's taken. And now, I had the leverage to take it. The first thing I noticed was the language. Everything changed in how they spoke to me: emails, texts, even the few calls they dared to make. Where before there was dismissal, now there was deference. Claire became Ms. Harper. You turned into we. And every message came dressed in the kind of politeness you reserve for someone you underestimated, and now fear might actually take the wheel. It was almost amusing. Almost. Matthew's message arrived just before noon on a Thursday, its tone carefully calibrated: we should align on the company's direction. Perhaps a private meeting would be helpful. Let me know what time suits your calendar, Ms. Harper. Ms. Harper. Not Claire. Not our sister. For someone who had tried to push me out of the company 48 hours earlier, he now sounded like someone trying to charm a potential investor. I let the message sit unread for a few hours before replying with a single sentence: send me your vision in writing before we meet. His response was immediate, too immediate to be genuine. Jason, of course, took a different approach. He showed up again, this time at the Harper Freight main office, coffee in hand, smile practiced. Hey, he said, stepping into my temporary office like we were picking up a conversation from yesterday. Thought I'd stop by and say hi. You're not on my calendar, I said, without looking up. Didn't think I needed to be, he replied, a little too cheerfully. Just wanted to welcome you back. Feels good, right? Having the office again? I finally looked at him. You never asked me why he did it. Jason frowned. What? My father, I said. You never once asked why he left me the majority. You only asked what you were going to lose. He shifted uncomfortably. We were just surprised, Claire. No, I said. You were exposed. He opened his mouth to say something else, but I returned to my laptop without another word. He stood there a few more seconds, then left, leaving the untouched coffee on my desk. I threw it away without opening the lid. Later that day, I walked the halls of Harper Freight's headquarters, not as a guest, not as a ghost, but as the person now in charge. Some employees looked away. Others gave me stiff nods. I could feel the questions in their eyes. Is she really running things now? Will she last? Does she even know what she's doing? And the truth was, I did not have all the answers. Not yet. But I had something even more dangerous than certainty: a plan to find out everything I needed. I scheduled a leadership meeting for the following week. The subject line was simple: internal audit and strategic realignment, mandatory attendance. Matthew and Jason were included as departmental contributors. The kind of polite demotion that says more than any insult ever could. That night, alone in my apartment again, I opened the envelope Alan had handed me, my father's personal notes. Among them were scribbles, thoughts, even regrets. One line stood out in his handwriting: Claire sees what others don't. That's what makes her dangerous. And that's why she has to lead. For years, he never said those words out loud. Maybe he couldn't. But now they lived on paper and in action. The company was mine to steer. My brothers had been warned. And whether they believed it or not, everything had already changed. I arrived 30 minutes early. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew they'd expect me to be late. Women in power are often anticipated to hesitate, to second guess, to need reassurance. So I walked into the main boardroom of Harper Freight's headquarters ahead of time, laid out every folder, aligned every chair, reviewed the screen for the presentation, and waited. Not for them. For the moment. The door opened at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. First came the senior executives: legal, operations, human resources, most of whom barely knew my name 2 weeks ago. They entered with expressions carefully molded between caution and curiosity. Then came Jason, checking his phone. And last, Matthew, who had always walked like he expected people to stand aside. This time, no one stood. And no one rose to greet him. They took their seats, and for a moment, the room felt like it had no air. I stood at the head of the table, hands steady. Good morning, I began. As you all know, effective immediately, I'm assuming majority control over Harper Freight Systems, following the directives left by Robert Harper. Some eyes flicked toward Matthew. He stared ahead, stone-faced. This is not a ceremonial shift. This is structural, legal, operational. And it begins now. I clicked the remote. The screen behind me came alive with a timeline. We're launching a full internal audit across all departments, contracts, procurement, executive bonuses, and vendor relationships. Every transaction over the past 5 years will be reviewed. No exceptions. Jason coughed. That's going to raise a lot of questions, especially with our partners. That's the idea, I replied, turning the page on the handouts I had prepared. We'll also be implementing a complete departmental reorganization. Streamlining. Logistics. Consolidating underperforming branches. Renegotiating high-cost contracts. Matthew finally spoke. You're making moves without consulting us. No, I said calmly. I'm making decisions as the executive with controlling interest. But I will welcome input from anyone prepared to contribute with transparency and integrity. There was a beat of silence. A long, heavy pause. Then someone I didn't expect, Rachel King, VP of Compliance, cleared her throat. I think an audit is long overdue, she said. Some of our contracts haven't been reviewed in years. It wasn't an endorsement. But it was a crack in the wall. Others started to nod. Slowly. Quietly. But clearly. I continued presenting, outlining the review committees, the schedule, the reporting structures. Not with arrogance, but with clarity. With the same precision I used in courtrooms. This was no longer about proving I belonged. This was about making it impossible to deny that I did. When the meeting ended, no one rushed out. There was a pause, a long one. And then, one by one, people stood and nodded. Not at Matthew. Not at Jason. At me. They didn't respect me yet. Not truly. But they feared being on the wrong side of change. And that was a beginning. Matthew stayed behind as the others left. This company was built by men who understand the business, he said quietly. And nearly buried by them, too, I replied. It's time for someone who understands more than just numbers. He didn't answer. Just walked out, shoulders stiff. That evening, I sat in my office, now fully mine, and watched the city beyond the windows. A storm was gathering in the distance. I could feel it in my bones. But for the first time, I welcomed it. The audit started with routine numbers, purchase orders, vendor logs, transport schedules. It was supposed to be a formality. Something to demonstrate diligence, polish the company's image, maybe eliminate a few inefficiencies. But numbers don't lie. And Harper Freight's numbers had stories buried deep in their columns. The first red flag came from procurement. Contracts with one supplier, Delbrook Transport Solutions, stood out. Year after year, their rates had increased, sometimes by nearly 20% without renegotiation. Jason's signature was on nearly all of them. I didn't jump to conclusions. There are always explanations in business. Loyalty to old partners. Emergency deals under pressure. Mistakes. But when I asked for the meeting notes from those negotiations, the file was empty. No memos. No emails. No records. Just invoices and approvals, signed off as priority clearance. I brought it up during our next strategy meeting. Jason barely blinked. Delbrook's been reliable, he said. Those deals were time-sensitive. I kept my voice steady. Then I'll need to see the documentation justifying those approvals. Jason shrugged. They might not all be in the system. A lot of it was fast-moving. You know how logistics can get. I nodded slowly, not pushing further. Not yet. That same afternoon, I received an email from someone I hadn't seen in years, Thomas Greer, a former warehouse manager who'd been dismissed under strange circumstances. I remembered him as serious, methodical, and fiercely loyal to the company. His message was short: "Ms. Harper, I have information you need to hear." I'd rather say it in person. We met the next morning in a small coffee shop near South Boston. Thomas looked older, worn out. But when he shook my hand, there was steel in his grip. "I knew your father," he said. "Not just from meetings. He came to the docks. Watched shipments. Talked to workers. He cared. Until things changed." "What do you mean?" He glanced around before answering. "Around 4 years ago, everything started getting shady. Certain suppliers were always approved. Others pushed out. We were told to ignore price discrepancies. If we asked questions, we got reassigned or fired." "Did Jason or Matthew know?" Thomas nodded once. "Jason signed off on most of it. Matthew knew enough to stay away. Everyone played their role." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Robert Harper trusted you," he said. "I saw the way he looked at you when you visited the warehouses. And because you're the only one who might fix this." His words hit harder than I expected. Not because of the accusation, but because they aligned with something I'd started to feel. This company, the one I now legally controlled, had been bleeding from within. And my father had known. That's why he made the decision he did. I thanked Thomas and promised confidentiality. When I returned to the office, I reviewed every contract with Delbrook. Then I asked legal to pull other high-value agreements approved in the same period. There was a pattern. Overcharges. Missing files. Sudden approvals. And Jason's name kept appearing. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because I wasn't ready to accuse, I was preparing to prove. If my brothers thought giving me the title was enough to calm me, they were wrong. Because the truth wasn't just my responsibility now, it was my weapon. And I was just beginning to understand how to use it. Power doesn't just shift, it threatens. And threatened men make mistakes. The first sign came through the press. A leak. A small industry blog published an anonymous tip: Harper Freight undergoing internal investigation for financial mismanagement. Sources suggest inexperience at the top. It wasn't a headline that would shake the market. But it wasn't random either. I read it 3 times before closing the tab. Only a handful of people knew about the audit. And all of them had something to lose. The second sign came the following week, when a critical meeting with a European logistics partner, months in planning, was mysteriously cancelled. The official explanation was a technical scheduling error. But when I called their director personally, she was surprised to hear from me. "Your brother said you had postponed the project," she said. "I did not," I replied. "Then you should know," she continued, "he asked to speak with us privately." I thanked her and hung up. Matthew was testing the limits. Seeing how far he could push while pretending to cooperate. But what he didn't understand was that silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. That afternoon, I met with HR and requested detailed records of every communication sent from executive accounts over the past 6 weeks. I framed it as part of the compliance protocol for the audit. Technically true. But in truth, I was looking for patterns. For fingerprints. What I found was deliberate. Jason had shared confidential board notes with an outside contact, an advisor with ties to one of our smaller competitors. It wasn't criminal. Not yet. But it was dangerous. Worse, a deleted draft email from Matthew's account had been recovered. It outlined a plan to push the audit into a PR-controlled failure, suggesting strategic media placements and building internal doubt about Claire's leadership trajectory. I printed it. Read it. Memorized it. Then locked it in a drawer. Not to confront him. Not yet. I had something better, evidence and time. Meanwhile, inside the company, something surprising started to shift. A few managers began reaching out quietly, asking questions, offering updates, even volunteering to support the review process. I saw it in their eyes. They weren't sure who would win this power war, but they were starting to bet on me. And I understood why. I wasn't fighting to control Harper Freight. I was cleaning up what others had dirted. I was restoring what had been corroded in boardrooms full of ego and silence. But sabotage has a way of evolving. 2 days later, our internal server went down, just long enough to delay key reports for the audit. IT labeled it a targeted disruption, possibly internal. Intentional? I asked the head of cybersecurity. He hesitated. Yes. Someone wanted to delay you. That night, I sat in my office long after the others had left. The city outside was quiet. My phone buzzed, another empty message from Jason, trying to play friendly again. I let it ring. Because I understood now, they weren't just trying to reclaim control. They were scared. Scared of what I'd uncover. Scared of what came next. And they were right to be. I hadn't expected to miss him. Not really. My relationship with my father had been a quiet war of absence, his silence, my distance, a shared fluency in things left unsaid. But as I walked through his old office late one evening, alone, I realized I was searching for something. Not comfort. Clarity. The space remained untouched. His desk still carried the faint scent of cigars he never smoked around us. The bookshelves lined with trade manuals, case studies, and old family photos, many of which didn't include me. I wasn't bitter. Just aware. A file drawer was left partially open. I almost ignored it. But something in me, curiosity or instinct, made me pull it out. Inside, beneath ledgers and expense reports, was a faded manila folder labeled personal. It wasn't much. A few handwritten notes. An old photograph of the three of us as kids, Matthew, Jason, and me, on the deck of a shipping freighter. I remembered the trip vaguely. I was 6. It had rained the whole time. My hair was frizzy. I hated that picture. But behind the photo was something else, a letter. Dated 8 months before his death. Addressed simply, to Claire. I read it sitting on the edge of his chair, the same one I had avoided for most of my life. Claire, if you are reading this, then things have already changed. I've tried, in my own flawed way, to guide this company and this family. But I see now that I've failed you, by not saying what I should have said when I was still alive. You were always different. That scared me. You didn't seek approval. You questioned things I had built my life defending. And because of that, I misjudged you. I thought you didn't want this world. But what I missed is that you wanted it to mean something. I have seen your strength, not in meetings, not in titles, but in how you endure. And I know you will be tested. They won't make it easy. But you were never meant to fit their mold. You were meant to reshape it. That's why I made the decision I did. Not out of sentiment. Out of certainty. Lead with what they lack, clarity, honesty, courage. And forgive me, if you can, for waiting so long to see it. Robert I didn't cry. Not in the way grief usually demands. But I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. He hadn't said the words to me when it mattered. But he'd left them where I could find them. That was his way. The next morning, I returned to the office with the letter folded inside my coat. I didn't show it to anyone. It wasn't proof for others. It was fuel, for me. Because this fight wasn't about titles or control anymore. It was about reclaiming something that had been buried under ego and fear. My father had handed me a broken machine and believed I could make it run again. And he was right. The boardroom was quiet in the way only high-stakes rooms can be: polished wood, filtered sunlight, the hum of tension thick as the air before a storm. Every chair was filled, every tie perfectly knotted, every face carefully unreadable. These were not people who bluffed easily. They had built empires from shipping routes and profit margins, and today, they had come not to listen, but to decide. At the center of it all, I stood. Alone. The investor meeting had been on the calendar for weeks. It was a standard quarterly presentation, the kind that had been Matthew's domain for years. But this time, the names had changed. The documents bore my initials. The voice presenting would be mine. Matthew, still seated at the table, had tried to seize the opening. Perhaps I should lead this one, he offered that morning, his tone smooth as glass. For continuity. I had looked at him without smiling. Continuity is exactly what I'm here to end. And so, he remained seated, like a shadow in a chair once built for him. I began the presentation with facts. No dramatics. No promises. Just numbers. Performance metrics. Bottlenecks exposed by the audit. Cost overruns connected to the very contracts I had flagged. The investors listened, some leaning forward, others scribbling notes. I saw one of them, Harold Klein, the man who controlled nearly 10% of our capital, glance at Matthew with the kind of skepticism money men rarely show in public. Then I pivoted. We've inherited strength, I said, but also stagnation. Harper Freight has relied too long on legacy relationships that no longer serve its growth. What we need now isn't tradition. It's vision. I outlined the restructuring plan. Regional consolidations. Digital tracking upgrades. A reorientation of international partnerships. I had numbers to back each point. Projections. Cost-benefit breakdowns. And for the first time in that room, I saw something shift, silence breaking not into resistance, but into attention. Jason, seated across the table, cleared his throat. Some of these changes feel radical. Cutting ties with legacy partners has consequences. I met his eyes. So does protecting bad contracts out of loyalty. The room held still for a breath. Then Harold Klein spoke. How long will this reorganization take? 18 months, I answered without hesitation. We'll be leaner, faster, and more competitive. We'll be transparent with quarterly updates and audits. And we'll repair the reputation that years of internal negligence have damaged. Another pause. Then someone clapped. It started slow, Harold. Then two others joined. It wasn't an ovation. But it was enough. The chair of the board stood. The motion to approve Claire Harper's restructuring plan is open. All in favor? Hands rose. Not all of them. But enough. Matthew didn't vote. Jason hesitated, then raised his hand, eyes never meeting mine. When the vote was counted, I didn't smile. I didn't thank them. I simply nodded and closed my laptop. Meeting adjourned. Outside, the hallway buzzed with quiet admiration. Some shook my hand. Some avoided eye contact. But no one questioned who was in charge anymore. In the elevator, alone again, I allowed myself one deep breath. Not of relief, but recognition. They had seen what I was capable of. And Matthew, once the golden heir, had been reduced to a silent witness in a room where his authority used to echo. Harper Freight had turned a page. And I had written the first line. The offer came in quietly, like most significant threats do. No press release. No sudden visit. Just a sealed envelope delivered by courier, hand-signed and time-stamped. I opened it in my office, still writing the aftershocks of the investor meeting. My instincts told me it wasn't coincidence. Victory draws attention. And attention draws opportunity, or danger. The logo on the letterhead was unmistakable, Callister Global Holdings. One of the most powerful conglomerates in international trade logistics. Ruthless, fast-moving, and known for acquiring struggling companies and turning them into money machines. We weren't struggling anymore. But perhaps, from the outside, we still looked vulnerable. Or maybe they saw what I was building and wanted it before it grew too big to swallow. Their proposal was direct, a partial acquisition. 35% of Harper Freight in exchange for a capital injection of $320 million. Terms negotiable. Leadership continuity requested, specifically under my name. I read that line twice. They wanted me to stay on as CEO. Matthew found out before I told him. I suspect he still had loyalists buried in accounting, and one of them must have leaked the preliminary financials tied to the proposal. He confronted me the same afternoon, in the hallway outside the boardroom. "This is your endgame?" he snapped. "You clean house, play the savior, and then hand us over to a corporate empire?" "I haven't accepted anything," I replied, calm. "But you're considering it." "I'm considering everything." He laughed once, bitterly. "And what do we become? Stockholders? Minor consultants in our own family's company?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because I knew too well. For Matthew and Jason, the company had always been about inheritance. About bloodlines and legacy. For me, it had become something else. A mission. A structure I could reform. A broken system I could rebuild. They clung to the name. I cared about what it did. I called an emergency meeting with the executive team that evening. The room was small, the tone informal. No suits, no recordings. Just the core leaders I had begun to trust: compliance, operations, strategy, legal. I laid out the proposal in full transparency. "It's a generous offer," I said. "But money alone doesn't define our future. It can't. Not after everything we've just fought to reclaim." They listened in silence. Then Rachel from compliance asked, "What would you do if you were unbound by fear?" I didn't answer right away. I sat with the question. Then I said, I'd build something that couldn't be bought. That night, I reviewed the numbers again. Harbor Freight didn't need saving. It needed direction. Purpose. Maybe Callister had seen the beginning of something that scared them. Maybe this offer wasn't an opportunity, it was a way to neutralize a threat before it grew teeth. By morning, my decision was made. Not because of ego. Because of legacy, the kind we earn, not inherit. I made the announcement in the same boardroom where my brothers had once plotted my exclusion. This time, the table was mine. The silence before I spoke was familiar, but the energy was different, expectant, uncertain. They were waiting for a signature. For a confirmation that Harbor Freight would accept Callister's offer and transition into a global powerhouse under a new umbrella. I stood, the proposal folder closed in front of me. Then I said the words no one expected to hear. "We're not selling." The room didn't react at first. It was as if they hadn't heard me correctly. Then Jason leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "What do you mean not selling?" "Claire, this is one of the largest logistics firms in the world. That kind of capital doesn't come around twice." I nodded. Which is exactly why I had to listen. And then say no. Matthew scoffed, arms folded. "This isn't a decision you make alone." "But it is," I replied. "And not because I own the majority shares, because I carry the responsibility now. You all said I didn't have vision. So let me show you what vision actually looks like." I opened a new folder and placed a different document on the table. It wasn't a sale agreement. It was a charter outlining the creation of a new institute within Harbor Freight. A nonprofit training division focused on developing young entrepreneurs in the logistics sector, with a strong emphasis on women in leadership, ethical business practices, and innovation in supply chain management. A few executives leaned in, reading quickly. Others exchanged glances. "We're taking 10% of our annual profit," I continued, "and investing it into something this industry has ignored for too long, preparing the next generation to lead with purpose. Not just power." Rachel from compliance blinked. "You're building an institute?" "Yes. A legacy not rooted in boardroom inheritance, but in opportunity. In access." Matthew looked genuinely stunned. "You're giving up millions of dollars for idealism?" "No," I said. "I'm building something sustainable. You think I want to create headlines? I want to create continuity." The reaction was mixed. Jason looked confused, maybe even embarrassed. A few board members looked intrigued. No one stood to applaud, but no one objected either. That week, the public statement went live. Harper Freight declined Callister's offer. In its place, we announced the launch of the Harper Institute for Inclusive Leadership. The media response was skeptical at first. Phrases like unexpected pivot, controversial reinvestment, and idealistic gamble filled the headlines. But the applications rolled in. Young women from logistics programs across the country applied for mentorships, internships, fellowships. For the first time in the company's long, conservative history, we weren't just known for moving goods, we were known for moving minds. 3 weeks later, a small article ran in an industry journal: Harper Freight's gamble is paying off. Reputation ratings up. New markets opening. Leadership redefined. And I smiled. Not because I was right, but because I was no longer waiting to be proven wrong. The new headquarters wasn't larger, just different. Open floors, glass walls, quiet corners meant for collaboration instead of command. The old symbols of power, mahogany panels, leather thrones, inherited offices, had been stripped away. We built a space where leadership could be heard, not just seen. Where legacy wasn't measured by whose name was on the door, but by what that name meant. It had been 8 months since I turned down Callister's offer. 8 months since the Harper Institute began training its first class, young women from Detroit, Savannah, Newark, Dallas. Some had never stepped into a boardroom before. Now, they were pitching logistics strategies to executives twice their age. They weren't grateful. They were ready. That morning, I entered the new boardroom to find 2 seats filled, Matthew and Jason. Both had been invited as guests, not decision-makers. Not to humiliate them. But because this was their family name too. And I wanted them to see what it had become. Matthew stood as I walked in. Not to interrupt, just out of reflex. Jason offered a tight smile. The kind you wear when you've lost the fight but not your pride. I sat at the head of the table. Someone passed me a fresh stack of updated documents, a quarterly summary, and a small, clean white card resting on top. My new business card. Claire Harper, Chief Executive Officer, President of the Board. Jason reached for a water bottle and paused, eyeing the card. Looks good on you, he said. His voice carried no bitterness. Only something quieter, acceptance, maybe even a trace of respect. Glad you think so, I replied. Matthew said nothing. But I saw it in the way he glanced around the room, at the diverse team, the digital dashboards, the strategic maps pinned with new partner regions. He knew the old Harper Freight was gone. And this one, he could neither control nor deny. The meeting began. We reviewed projections, partnerships, and institute reports. Every voice at the table contributed. Not out of obligation, but alignment. No one talked over anyone. No one raised their voice to claim space. At the end, a young woman from the institute, now a junior associate, presented a new proposal, using AI to optimize our route strategies in underrepresented territories. Her pitch was bold, her tone firm. When she finished, the room paused, then nodded. I turned to her. Let's build it, I said. After the meeting, as I walked to my office, I passed the wall where our founder's portrait used to hang. My father's image had been replaced by a timeline of impact, metrics from our leadership program, maps of our expansion, testimonials from new clients and graduates. At the center, a quote from Robert Harper. You don't just move products. You move futures. I stood there for a moment, reading his words, remembering the man who had rarely said the things I needed to hear, but who, in the end, left me the tools to speak them myself. No revenge had been taken. Only justice. Quiet. Measured. Irrefutable. I stepped into my office, closed the door behind me, and placed the card on my desk. It wasn't just a name. It was a promise.